For the past 300 years, the subcontinent of India and beyond has been ruled with an iron fist. The Mughals and their empire have become increasingly fabulously wealthy. It is considered the most prosperous region in the entire world. The Mughal rulers are draped head to toe in lavish jewels, living in vast, luxurious palaces with servants bowing to their every whim. But India is also a place of bohemian freedom, where culture, art, and music thrives. Their trade routes, spices, and silks are the empire's lifeblood and are protected with all of the empire's might, for now. Hello and welcome to the channel. I am the Knight of History and this is India, part number 2 of the British Empire series. We are going to have a quick look at the British economic and eventually military invasion of India. If you haven't yet, please go ahead and like, comment and subscribe. Now let's go ahead and get into this. Throughout the 16th century, European merchants began to trade with India, which was considered at the time as the most wealthy region on earth. India was ruled by Mughal emperors who were originally Muslim warlords hailing from Central Asia. But by the 1650s, these warlords had conquered all of India, but India was a mighty large place. The Mughal emperor ruled from his peacock throne in the Red Fort in Delhi, and he divided his empire into provinces. Each province had a prince known as a Nawab, who ruled on his behalf. European merchants, private companies, wanted to trade with India. They wanted the valuable crops and goods like sugar, saltpeter, indigo dye, and the most importantly, the high-quality cotton and silk. But to be able to trade with India, they needed the emperor's permission, along with the Nawab's permission. The very first Europeans to be able to get this permission were, of course, the Portuguese. Then the Dutch with their world-beating VOC company, but finally the English and even the French were given permission to trade, and they would build fortified trade posts known as factories along the Indian coasts to protect their goods. In 1600, Queen Elizabeth I gave a royal charter to a private company known as the East India Company. Over the next 100 years, the East India Company barged their way in, gaining permission to trade with three main factories: Bombay, known as Mumbai today, in the northwest, Madras, known as Chennai, in the southeast, and Calcutta, known as Kolkata, in northeastern province of Bengal. The British in India were very different compared to their American colonies, because unlike their colonies in America, the East Indian Company factories were built for trade only. They didn't want to have settlements. The British therefore paid little attention to the interior of India, as they wanted to just milk the country for its trade. This is where we get many young men going to the East India Company to make their fortunes, because the earning potential was second to none. They were known as nabobs. Many of these young men, however, died along the way. But if you manage to survive, you'll be able to go back to England and live an almost aristocratic lifestyle. One of these young men traveled to India in 1674, and his name was Thomas Pitt. Like many of the young men, he worked for the East India Company, but he also conducted his own private trade on the side. In 1701, he came across a diamond, 410 carats. At the time, the largest diamond the world had ever seen, now known as the Pitt diamond. He eventually sold it to the French royal family for 5 times the original price in 1717, making him one of the richest nabobs in England. In this relatively early stage of the British in India, there were intermarriages. The British really looked up to the Indians for their beauty, culture, wealth, and amazing ideas, whilst the Indians looked down upon the British as a small, distant, insignificant island on the other side of the world. This is perfectly depicted in this painting with Jahangir, the Mughal emperor, divine, high up on his throne, God-blessed, painted to look larger to imply his significance, the Persian kings around him, and then in the bottom left of the picture we can see an almost sickly man, James I of England. However, by the 1740s, that was beginning to change. The once untouchable power of the Mughal emperors began to wane. Afghan armies had begun to invade India from the north. Nawabs, regional princes, were breaking away from the empire to form their own kingdoms, and India was becoming a little bit of a mess. In response to this confusion, the East India Company began to refortify its coastal factories, and then the company realized that they may have an opportunity if only they had an army. So all of a sudden, this private company began to build one, recruiting troops from Indian war castes and British military officers to lead them. By the 1750s, the company had become involved in the power struggles of competing regional princes, these Nawabs. Often they would fight against rival Nawabs, which were sometimes backed by the French in a sort of proxy war between the English and the French. In 1756, the region of Bengal gained a new Nawab, Siraj-ud-Daulah. I'm going to call him Siraj, who resented the growing size of Calcutta, which was Britain's trading post in Bengal. So, driven by economic factors, as most wars are, Siraj forcefully seized Calcutta from the British, and this news spread like wildfire. The news of the loss of Calcutta reached Madras, where one young ambitious army officer, commissioned by the East India Company, decided to take action. His name was Robert Clive, a brute of a man. Clive marched his much smaller force of just 3,000 men, both made up of Indians and Europeans, the 1,000 miles from Madras to Calcutta to meet Siraj's 50,000 men. Even though Clive was brutish, he was talented as a soldier and politician. Before he even got there, he met with Mir Jafar, Siraj's main commander of his army, and convinced him to betray Siraj. That night, there was a massive storm, which rendered a lot of the Indian forces immobile. They were stagnant and became sitting ducks. The Battle of Plassey on the 23rd of June 1757 was a big blow for Siraj, who capitulated, and Clive installed Mir Jafar as a puppet Nawab of Bengal region. This is where we get the start of the East India Company, not even a country, really meddling with Indian politics, moving much of the cotton and silk trade to the UK, meaning that India's lifeblood of economy and prosperity began to wane. By 1765, at the Treaty of Allahabad, the Mughal Emperor Shah Alam II handed over rulership of the Bengal region to Clive, becoming its governor. And this is the turning point, marking the beginning of the British Empire in India. The treaty gave the East Indian Company the right to tax 20 million people, making around £3 million annually in the 18th century. For the company, the territory and the taxation would prove even more profitable than trade. The intermarriages and love for the Indian culture that the British once had quickly disappeared, and the East India Company's army grew to over 100,000 men and continued to forcefully expand their boundaries across India. A lot of this was unsanctioned by the British government and the directors of the company back in London. It was often young, opportunistic army officers who acted independently. But nonetheless, when the territories were taken, the bigwigs back in London kept their mouths shut as the gold filled their coffers. By 1815, the East India Company ruled much of the subcontinent. 40 million Indians, including the Mughal emperor himself, were living under the company's rule, with the head of the company, the Governor-General, being able to be the de facto ruler of much of India. That was until 1858, when the British Parliament took over the control to see more wealth roll through their doors. But this isn't the only thing that rolled through their doors. Bahadur Shah Zafar, the last Mughal emperor, was deposed in 1857 by the British after causing an uprising trying to lead his people against the British. But before that, there was a 5-year-old Maharaj of the Sikh Empire, the ruler of the Punjab region, known as Dalip Singh. He was shoved on the throne after his uncles and father killed each other. On his arm, like his predecessors, he wore a bracelet with a diamond. After 2 Anglo-Sikh wars, at the age of just 10 years old, he was forced to sign a peace treaty giving away all of his possessions and land, including the bracelet diamond, known as the Kohinoor diamond, to the East India Company, who eventually gave this Kohinoor diamond to Queen Victoria. The young Dalip Singh, the Maharaj of Punjab, was sent into exile into England, not really knowing what would become of him. He was a young boy, after all. The Kohinoor diamond, once the symbol of rule and conquest in his empire, was displayed at the Great Exhibition in London in 1851. Then cut down to be made smaller and oval in Holland. Dalip Singh lived in various courts with Queen Victoria, and after a few years she invited him to come visit Buckingham Palace, where she showed him the diamond. After studying it for some time, and with remarkable restraint, he said, "It is to me, ma'am, the greatest pleasure thus to have the opportunity as a loyal subject of myself tendering to my sovereign, the Kohinoor." The young man, an emperor by the age of 5, was giving the diamond to her, even though it was no longer his to give. Years later, the diamond was placed into a crown for Queen Mary's coronation in 1937, and we would have seen the diamond once more this year in 2023 in the coronation of King Charles, when Queen Camilla had the same crown placed on her head, but she had the diamond swapped out with another diamond, the Cullinan diamond, which had been given to the royal family by the people of Transvaal in South Africa. I can guarantee you that the British influence in India certainly does not end there in the 19th century, but spilled over almost halfway through the 20th century with massacres, racism, the breaking up of a country, splitting nations, cultures, and in some cases, families. But this is not my story to tell. It is still in living memory of those who witnessed the partition of India in 1947, creating modern-day India, Bangladesh, and Pakistan. The displacement of around 20 million people, causing around 2 million deaths. The border between Pakistan and India is still considered a hotbed for potential nuclear war, meaning willed destruction. The British story in India is clearly not a happy one. Thank you so much for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe. If you're feeling generous, go donate to the charity link down below. The more you know.